My fiancée canceled our wedding because I refused to sell my grandfather's legacy. When I was a kid, my grandpa's farm smelled like freshly cut hay, motor oil, and freedom. That combination hit different, you know? Pure American nostalgia in scent form. I was a skinny 10-year-old holding a wrench way too big for my hands, sitting on an old milk crate in his barn while Grandpa Raymond Wallace told stories about his dream, restoring a Tucker 48, a car that once dared to challenge Detroit's automotive giants. I remember how his eyes would light up whenever he talked about that car. "This isn't just a vehicle, Ethan," he'd say with that gravelly voice weathered by years of cigarettes and hard work. "This is Preston Tucker's soul on wheels." The man wanted cars that flew down the highway like nothing else. His calloused hands would gesture wildly, painting pictures in the air of sleek aerodynamic bodies and headlights that turned with the steering wheel. We'd spend whole Saturdays in that barn, Motown classics blasting from his dusty radio. The Four Tops, The Temptations, Marvin Gaye, the soundtrack of his youth becoming the soundtrack of my childhood. Grandma would bring us burgers wrapped in foil, and we'd eat while surrounded by tools and dreams. In my eyes, my grandpa wasn't just an old man with grease-stained hands. He was a superhero who could resurrect dead engines with nothing but determination and a few choice words when a boat wouldn't budge. But time's relentless, man. The seasons changed, years passed, and Grandpa got older and more fragile. I tried to visit the farm whenever I could, but those visits became harder as I built my own life. The once neat field surrendered to wild grass. The paint on the house peeled away like old memories, and the Tucker sat under a canvas tarp in the corner of the barn, collecting dust like abandoned dreams. I grew up, moved to Pittsburgh, became an auto mechanic. Not glamorous work, but honest. I'd spend my days fixing other people's cars, my hands carrying the same permanent oil stains as my grandfather's. Nights were for cold beers, Springsteen on the radio, and planning a future with Heather. Heather was everything I thought I wanted. Smart, beautiful, ambitious. The kind of woman who had her entire life mapped out in a color-coded planner. She worked at a real estate office and dreamed of a house with a kitchen just like on HGTV. All granite countertops and stainless steel appliances that cost more than my yearly salary. When she talked about our future home, her eyes sparkled the same way Grandpa's did when he talked about the Tucker. Different dreams, different worlds. Life was settling into a predictable rhythm. Work, beers with the guys on Fridays, house hunting with Heather on weekends. I was following a script that everyone follows, the American dream, version 2.0. Decent job, attractive partner, 30-year mortgage. The script everyone follows because it's easier than writing your own. Then the call came that changed everything. Grandpa was in the hospital. His heart was failing. I drove those 3 hours to the farm in record time, the speedometer pushing numbers my truck hadn't seen in years. The hospital was one of those small-town facilities where everyone knows everyone. Nurses called me honey, and remember when I broke my arm falling from the hayloft when I was 12. Grandpa looked small in that hospital bed, hooked up to machines that beeped and whirred. His eyes, usually so full of life and stories, were tired. But when he saw me, he smiled that Raymond Wallace smile that could fix just about anything. "You came," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For a week, I split my time between the hospital and the farm. At night, I'd sleep in my old bedroom, the walls still covered with the same car posters from my teenage years. During the day, I'd sit with Grandpa, listening to him talk about the good old days, about the Tucker, about regrets and dreams. "Don't let life push you into a corner, Ethan," he told me one afternoon, his voice stronger for a moment. "Most folks spend their whole lives being what others expect them to be. That's no way to live." I nodded, thinking about my life in Pittsburgh, wondering if I was living or just existing. Grandpa passed away on a Thursday morning. The sun was just coming up, painting the hospital room in soft golden light. It was peaceful, they said. I stood by the window afterward, watching the hospital parking lot fill up with people starting their normal days, unaware that the world had just lost Raymond Wallace. The funeral was small, just how he would have wanted it. Old friends from his mechanic days, neighbors from around the farm, family members I hadn't seen in years. Everyone had a story about him, about his kindness, his stubbornness, his belief that anything broken could be fixed with enough patience and the right tools. I returned to Pittsburgh afterward, feeling hollow. Heather tried to understand, but grief isn't something you can plan for in a color-coded calendar. I went through the motions, work, home, sleep, but everything felt off, like driving a car with the alignment just slightly wrong. Then the letter arrived. It was a Tuesday. I remember because Tuesdays were always slow at the shop, and I'd left early. The envelope had that official look that immediately makes your stomach drop, like when you see police lights in your rearview mirror. Inside was a letter from a notary. Grandpa Raymond's will have been processed. He'd left me the farm. And the Tucker. I stood in my cramped apartment kitchen, reading that letter 3 times while Heather watched some reality show in the living room. The man who taught me that dreams were worth the grease under your fingernails, even if they never quite came true, had left me his greatest unfinished dream. The drive back to the farm took 3 hours, but felt like traveling back in time. Every mile marker brought another memory. Fishing trips, harvest seasons, the smell of Grandma's apple pie cooling on the windowsill. When I finally pulled up the long, overgrown driveway, the farm looked like a ghost of itself. The white paint had yellowed. The porch sagged like it was tired of standing, and weeds had claimed victory over what used to be Grandma's vegetable garden. The barn door creaked like it was complaining when I pushed it open. Dust particles danced in the beams of light that streamed through the gaps in the roof. And there it was, a large shape under a filthy canvas tarp, sitting exactly where it had been since I was a kid. My hands trembled slightly as I pulled off the cover. Dust exploded into the air, making me cough, but when it settled, I saw it, the Tucker 48, serial number 00051. The car my grandfather had called his unfinished symphony. The torpedo-shaped body was dulled by decades of dust and neglect. The once gleaming chrome was now pitted with rust. But even in its deteriorated state, it had presence, like meeting a fallen war hero. The Tucker 48 wasn't just any car. It was an American legend, a monument to innovation, and what might have been. In 1948, Preston Tucker created a vehicle ahead of its time, a massive 5.5-liter engine, headlights that turned with the steering wheel, an aerodynamic body that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie, safety features that wouldn't become standard for decades. But GM, Ford, and Chrysler, the big three, they felt threatened. They crushed Tucker's company through lawsuits and smear campaigns. They were afraid of competition, afraid of change. Only 51 cars were ever made. My grandfather had been a test driver for Tucker. He saved this particular car because he believed the system will always hate dreamers. He dreamed of restoring it, but time and illness took him before he could finish what he started. As I ran my hand along the dusty fender, I could almost hear his voice. "Finish this, Ethan." I spent the day exploring the farm, opening windows that hadn't been opened in years, finding old photographs, remembering. In Grandpa's bedroom, I found a shelf of journals, meticulous notes about the Tucker, parts he'd tracked down, restoration techniques he'd researched. His whole life, preparing for a project he'd never complete. I stayed up all night reading those journals, feeling like he was talking to me through the pages. The next day, I called Heather and told her about the inheritance. She drove out that weekend, wearing impractical shoes that sank into the mud of the driveway. Her reaction wasn't what I'd expected. She took one look at the farm, with its peeling paint and sagging roof, then at the Tucker in the barn, and her face crumpled like she'd smelled something bad. "This is junk, Ethan. All of it. The property might be worth something if we clear it. But that rusty old car, just sell it all, and we can put the money toward a real house. One with that open concept kitchen we've been looking at." I tried to explain what the Tucker meant, its historical significance, what it had meant to my grandfather. But Heather saw only a decaying farm and a worthless old car. Not a legacy, not a dream, just assets to be liquidated. My family wasn't much better. Dad and Aunt Linda came out the following weekend. They stood in the barn, arms crossed, shaking their heads. "Ethan, enough chasing after Grandpa's fantasies," Dad said, his voice tinged with the same disappointment he'd had when I chose trade school over college. "Live in the real world. Sell this place Use the money for something practical. I tried to make them understand. This isn't just a car. This is Grandpa's dream. My dream, too. But they'd already decided. The farm was a burden, the Tucker a fantasy, and I was being childish for not seeing it. They left with tight hugs and concerned looks, the kind you give someone you think is making a terrible mistake. Heather's ultimatum came 3 weeks after Grandpa's funeral. We were standing in the barn, the Tucker between us like a third person in our relationship. I'm not living on some rundown farm in the middle of nowhere, she said, her voice sharp as she gestured around. And I'm not watching you waste your life on this pile of rust. Either you sell all this and come back to Pittsburgh, or there won't be a wedding. You know what's funnier than a broken heart? When your fiancée calls a Tucker 4.8, one only 51 ever made, a piece of automotive history, a rusty bucket. I couldn't help but laugh when she said that. I told her, Heather, this car could have starred in 1940 sci-fi movies. It's the Batmobile of its era. She just rolled her eyes and walked out of the barn. I kept laughing because in that moment, I realized something liberating. I was free to choose my path for the first time in years. I stood there in the barn for a long time after she left, looking at the Tucker. I thought about what my grandfather would do, what he would say. He never sold this car, not even when times were tough and offers came in. He believed in preserving something special, something that represented American innovation and the fight against corporate giants. Grandpa wouldn't sell, I whispered to the empty barn. And neither will I. I chose the dream. The cost was high. Heather threw her engagement ring on the kitchen counter of our apartment when I came to collect my things. You're choosing a dead man's fantasy over our future, she said, not looking at me as I packed my clothes into duffel bags. My family stopped calling for a while. Friends in Pittsburgh thought I'd lost my mind. You inherited a farm and a vintage car, and you're complaining? They'd say, not understanding that inheritance comes with responsibility, with purpose. I packed everything I owned into my pickup truck and moved to the farm permanently. The first night alone, there was the quietest night of my life. No traffic, no neighbors, just the occasional hoot of an owl and the creaking of an old house settling. In the barn, I opened Grandpa's notebook of Tucker notes and made a promise to the dusty air. Grandpa, I'm going to finish your project, and I'm going to prove you were right about this car, about dreams being worth fighting for. That night, I slept on an old couch in the living room, covered with a blanket that still smelled faintly of my grandmother's perfume. I was alone on a decaying farm with nothing but a rusted car and a promise made to a dead man. My old life had burned to ashes, but something in me felt alive for the first time in years. This was only the beginning. As I drifted off to sleep, I had no idea that the next morning would change everything. When I would find my grandfather's letter in the glove compartment of the Tucker, and my journey would truly begin. Morning hit the farm like it had nowhere better to be. The first rays of sunlight streamed through the cracks in the barn's wooden walls, painting stripes across the Tucker's dusty body. I'd settled into the farmhouse, my grandfather's home now mine. The place was frozen in time, filled with memories and dust in equal measure. It wasn't much by modern standards, but a character that new builds could only pretend to have. The house had become home, even though the mice seemed to think they were the primary tenants, and I was just a guy crashing in their domain. Every night I'd hear them scurrying between the walls, having what sounded like rodent block parties while I tried to sleep. But I didn't mind the company. Something about being alone on 40 acres makes you appreciate any signs of life. Every morning, I'd wake up with the sun, make a pot of coffee strong enough to dissolve a spoon, and head straight to the barn. The ritual became sacred, me, the Tucker, and the ghost of my grandfather watching over my shoulder. Sometimes I swore I could smell his Old Spice and motor oil scent lingering in the air. It was on the third day that I found the letter. I'd been cleaning out the Tucker's interior, vacuuming decades of dust and debris from the seats. The glove compartment was stuck, refusing to open after years of neglect. When it finally gave way with a crack that sounded like old bones breaking, a yellowed envelope tumbled out. My name was written on it in my grandfather's unmistakable handwriting, all capital letters with a slight right tilt, like the words were leaning into a strong wind. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it, the paper fragile and thin between my fingers. "Ethan," it read, "if you're reading this, two things have happened. I've moved on to the big garage in the sky, and you've chosen not to sell the Tucker. I always knew you had more sense than your father gives you credit for." I had to stop reading for a moment, my throat suddenly tight. Even from beyond the grave, Grandpa knew me better than anyone. The Tucker 48 isn't just a car, son. It's a statement. A middle finger raised high to the corporations that crush dreams for profit. Preston Tucker was a visionary, not just a businessman. He wanted to build something revolutionary, and the powers that be couldn't stand it. Sound familiar? That's the story of America. Dreamers versus profit machines. I sat in the Tucker's driver's seat, the letter still in my hands, and looked out through the windshield. I could almost see my grandfather standing there, cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth, that Clint Eastwood half-smile on his face, nodding approvingly. "Finish what I started, Ethan. Not for me, for yourself, for the principle of the thing. Because some things matter more than practicality. Some things are worth saving, even when the whole world tells you to let them go." The letter ended with simple instructions for where to find a stash of Tucker parts and a list of contacts, old mechanics and restoration specialists who might help. That letter lit a fire in me. I stepped out of the Tucker with a new sense of purpose, like I'd been drafted into a mission bigger than myself. This wasn't just about fixing up an old car anymore. This was about continuing a legacy of defiance against the machine of conformity. I taped the letter to the wall of the barn, right above my makeshift workbench. Every time I felt lost or questioned what the hell I was doing with my life, I'd glance up at it and remember, this matters. Maybe not to the world, but to me, and to him. The first week of restoration was like being thrown into the deep end of a pool when you're still learning to swim. I started breaking down the Tucker component by component, taking hundreds of pictures at every stage so I'd know how to put it back together. The engine was a jigsaw puzzle made of rusty metal. Half the part were C's, and the other half looked like they'd been salvaged from a shipwreck. Grandpa's journals helped immensely. He documented everything meticulously, where certain parts could be found, which ones needed to be custom fabricated, how the unique Tucker systems worked. But even with his guidance, I felt like a high school student trying to take the MCAT. Everything was foreign, complicated, intimidating. I started recording the process on my phone. Nothing fancy. Just me talking through what I was doing as I worked, explaining the significance of each part, sharing stories Grandpa had told me about the Tucker Company. I'd upload the videos to TikTok at night, using the farm's painfully slow internet connection, mostly as a way to hold myself accountable. To my surprise, people actually watched. The first video got a couple hundred views. By the fifth one, I was hitting thousands. The comments section filled with gearheads, history buffs, and restoration enthusiasts. It's like watching history come back to life. One comment read. Another said, "Your grandpa is somewhere smiling his ass off right now." The Tucker became my obsession. I'd wake up thinking about intake manifolds and go to sleep dreaming about transmission linkages. My hands were permanently stained with grease, and I'd find myself absent-mindedly sketching Tucker parts on napkins while eating dinner. I was broke, exhausted, and happier than I'd been in years. That's when Sophie Harper roared into my life. I was working in a barn with the doors open to catch the summer breeze when I heard it, the unmistakable rumble of a V8 engine with glass backs, getting louder as it approached the farm. The sound was like a rock concert speeding down my gravel driveway. A cherry red 1967 Mustang fastback slid to a stop in a cloud of dust outside the barn. AC/DCs, back in black, blasting loud enough to scare every bird within a mile radius. The driver cut the engine, and the sudden silence was almost as shocking as the noise had been. She stepped out of the car like she was walking onto a stage. Worn jeans, a vintage Shelby Cobra t-shirt, and a confidence that seemed to bend the air around her. Hair the color of engine oil, pulled back in a messy ponytail, and the kind of smile that makes you instantly forget whatever you were about to say. "So you're the crazy guy who's fixing up a Tucker 48, she said, walking straight into the barn without waiting for an invitation. Dad said some city boy inherited Ray Wallace's place. Thought I'd check if the rumors were true. Sophie Harper was from the farm down the road, daughter of the local auto shop owner. She'd grown up with a wrench in her hand and motor oil in her veins. She knew more about cars than Google and could disassemble an engine blindfolded. Her dad had been friends with my grandfather, which apparently gave her the right to walk into my barn and start examining my restoration project without so much as a hello. "A Tucker 48, she said, circling the partially disassembled car with the reverence of someone in a museum. "The rock star of the 1940s automotive world. You know what you're doing with this thing." Before I could answer, she was already pointing out issues I hadn't even noticed. Problems with the rear suspension setup, the incorrect routing of some wires I'd been working on, the way I'd positioned the engine hoist. All with the casual expertise of someone who'd been doing this since birth. "You're either completely insane or some kind of genius," she declared after thorough inspection. "I haven't decided which yet." I smiled and replied with one of Grandpa's favorite sayings. My grandfather used to say the line between those two is thinner than cigarette paper. She laughed, a genuine head-thrown-back laugh that echoed off the barn walls. And just like that, for the first time in months, Heather's face didn't immediately come to mind when I thought about tomorrow. Sophie became a regular at the farm. She'd show up after finishing at her dad's shop, sometimes bringing rare parts she'd tracked down, other times just bringing beer and mechanical wisdom. She told me stories about Preston Tucker, how he'd fought against the big three automakers, how they'd sabotage his company through lawsuits and smear campaigns because they were afraid of his innovations. The guy was building cars with seatbelts, padded dashboards, and a third headlight that turned with the steering wheel back when other companies were still thinking safety features were for wimps, she explained one evening as we worked on cleaning the Tucker's unique rear-engine bay. He was disrupting Detroit before disruption was a Silicon Valley buzzword. Having Sophie around changed everything. Suddenly, I wasn't just working on an old car. I was part of something bigger, a story of American innovation and resistance. The restoration took on new meaning. Every part we cleaned, every component we restored, felt like a small victory against the corporations that had tried to bury Preston Tucker's dream. The Tucker's uniqueness became more apparent as we dug deeper. The rear-mounted, horizontally opposed engine, the innovative torque converter transmission, the aerodynamic design that was decades ahead of its time. This wasn't just an old car. This was a vision of what could have been frozen in metal and chrome. Our big breakthrough came when Sophie connected me with an old restoration specialist named Frank Bellini, who had known my grandfather. Frank was in his 80s now, living in a retirement community in Florida, but his mind was as sharp as ever. We spent hours on the phone as he shared his knowledge of the Tucker's unique optical system. Ray always said that car was meant to have eyes that could see around corners, Frank told me in his Brooklyn-tinged accent. Preston Tucker wanted drivers to be able to see better at night, to see what was coming before it hit them. Metaphorical, when you think about it. Through Frank, we managed to track down original Tucker headlight assemblies, the distinctive three-eyed front end that made the car look like something from a sci-fi movie. He even had original transmission blueprints tucked away in his garage, which he shipped to us along with a handwritten note. Ray would be proud. Don't let the bastards grind you down. Sophie and I developed a rhythm, working side by side in the barn until late into the evening. She knew when to talk and when silence was needed. She understood the reverence I had for my grandfather's project without me having to explain it. Sometimes our hands would brush as we reached for the same tool, and I'd feel an electric current that had nothing to do with the Tucker's wiring system. One evening, as the summer sun was setting and painting the barn in golden light, Sophie was leaning over the engine compartment, pointing out something about the fuel delivery system. Her face was animated, passionate, beautiful in a way that glossy magazine covers could never capture. "This Tucker," she said, "is like Elvis, hounded and harassed by the man until they shut him down. But you know what? He's going to sing again." I don't think I realized I was falling for her until that moment. It hit me like a backfiring engine, sudden, surprising, a little bit terrifying. This wasn't part of the plan. I was supposed to be focused on the restoration, on fulfilling my grandfather's legacy. But life has a way of throwing unexpected parts into your engine, and sometimes they fit better than the originals. The TikTok videos continued to gain traction. What had started as a personal journal became something of a phenomenon in the classic car restoration community. People were invested in the Tucker's story, in my story. Comments poured in with encouragement, advice, offers of help or parts. One user wrote, "Watching you restore this car is like watching America remember what it's supposed to be about." It was Sophie who suggested we check the hidden compartment under the Tucker's back seat. "Your grandfather was crafty," she said one evening. All the old-timers had secret spots in their cars for important stuff. We were trying to figure out why the seat cushion seemed to sit slightly higher on one side, and she thought there might be something underneath. Sure enough, when we carefully removed the seat cushion, we found a small metal box bolted to the floor. It looked custom-made, with RW etched into the lid. Inside, protected from the elements and time, was another envelope. My name was on this one, too, but the handwriting was shakier, written later in my grandfather's life. "I knew you wouldn't give up," the second letter began. "You never were one to take the easy road, even as a kid. Remember when you spent 3 weeks building that go-kart instead of just asking for one for your birthday?" I laughed out loud, remembering the disastrous homemade go-kart that had nearly sent me to the emergency room. "There's a lesson in this old car, Ethan. Don't sell your soul for convenience. Don't trade your dreams for comfort. The world is full of people who gave up what they loved for what they thought they should want. Don't be one of them." I stood in the middle of the barn, that second letter in my oil-stained hands, and felt something shift inside me. This wasn't just about a car anymore. This was about a philosophy of life. About choosing the harder path because it's the one that matters. About preserving something beautiful even when logic says to let it go. "You okay?" Sophie asked, watching my face. I nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then I handed her the letter. She read it silently, her expression softening. "Your grandfather was a wise man," she said finally, "and he knew you pretty damn well." The Tucker began to take shape over the next few weeks. The body was cleaned and prepped for eventual painting. The engine components were either restored or replaced with custom-fabricated parts. The unique interior, with its padded dashboard and crash-resistant design, started coming together piece by piece. Sophie became more than just a helping hand. She became a partner in the restoration. In the mission, she had contacts I didn't, knowledge I lacked, and a stubborn determination that matched my own. Together, we were bringing the Tucker back to life, one salvage part at a time. There were nights when doubt would creep in, usually around 2 a.m. when I was alone in the old house, listening to mice have their nightly parties. Was I wasting my time? Was I throwing away a future with Heather for a pile of metal and a dead man's dream? Was I just afraid of growing up, of settling down, of becoming my father? But then morning would come, and I'd walk into the barn to see the Tucker waiting, a little more complete each day. I'd read my grandfather's letters again and feel that certainty return. Some things are worth fighting for, even if the fight doesn't make sense to anyone else. The Tucker was beginning to breathe again, and somehow, so was I. The farm, which had seemed like a burden at first, began to feel like home. The wide open spaces, the quiet nights, the freedom to work with my hands. It all fit me better than my life in Pittsburgh ever had. Sophie fit too, in a way Heather never could. She understood the value of grease under your fingernails, the satisfaction of bringing something broken back to life. She didn't dream of granite countertops. She dreamed of open roads and engines that roar like living things. I could feel my grandfather smiling down from whatever celestial auto shop he was running now, nodding in approval at both the restoration and the woman helping me complete it. But when the Tucker's engine coughed alive for the first time in over 50 years, sputtering and reluctant but undeniably alive, I suddenly understood. The real struggle was just beginning, because bringing something back from the dead is only the first step. Keeping alive in a world that once tried to kill it, that's the true test of dedication. I looked at Sophie, her face glowing with triumph as the engine settled into an uneven idle, and knew we were in for one hell of a ride. Restoring the Tucker was like boxing with your own shadow. Exhausting, frustrating, and impossible to win cleanly. The engine that had coughed to life so triumphantly decided it wasn't ready for a comeback tour. It sputtered, backfired, and then went silent again, like it was giving us the mechanical equivalent of the middle finger. The suspension crumbled in my hands like decades-old cookies, and my bank account was evaporating faster than spilled gasoline on hot asphalt. That first moment when the engine had fired up turned out to be a tease. A brief glimpse of success before reality came crashing back. Sophie and I spent the next week troubleshooting, testing, and cursing. The Tucker was testing us, seeing if we were worthy of his resurrection. Engines are like stubborn old men, Sophie said one night as we leaned over the open hood, flashlights illuminating the complex maze of the Tucker's heart. They only start talking when they're good and ready. Every victory was followed by 3 new problems. Fix the carburetor. Discover the fuel pump is shot. Repair the wiring. Find that the distributor is cracked. It was mechanical whack-a-mole, with each solution bringing new challenges popping up elsewhere. My savings account, never impressive to begin with, was now on life support. Classic car parts aren't exactly sold at Walmart, and Tucker-specific components might as well be artifacts from an alien civilization. I started selling off possessions just to keep the project alive. My TV, my gaming console, even my beloved pickup truck. Sophie watched me hand over the keys to my Ford F-150 to a guy from 2 counties over who'd seen my online ad. The truck had been with me since college. Witnessed 1,000 road trips and late-night food runs. But the cash would buy a rare carburetor that a collector in Minnesota was willing to part with. "You're either a hero or a complete idiot," she said as the man drove away in my truck. I just shrugged. My grandfather always said those are usually the same thing. We worked late into the night, most nights. The barn became our world, a universe of tools, parts, and possibility illuminated by shop lights and determination. Sophie would bring takeout from the diner in town, and we'd eat sitting on upturned milk crates, grease-stained hands wrapped around foil-covered burgers, talking about everything and nothing. I found my grandfather's old cassette collection one night, while looking for a specific wrench in a storage cabinet. The plastic cases were yellow with age, but the tapes inside still worked in the ancient player we unearthed from the same cabinet. The Temptations, the Four Tops, Marvin Gaye. Suddenly the barn was filled with sounds from another era, the perfect soundtrack for bringing a piece of history back to life. I told Sophie about Grandpa's dream one night, as my girl played softly in the background. He didn't just want to restore the Tucker. I explained, tightening a bolt on the rear suspension. He wanted to create a museum for what he called the survivor cars, vehicles that represented innovation and rebellion against the corporate machine, cars that survived despite the odds. Sophie listened, sitting cross-legged on a workbench, her eyes reflecting the overhead lights like stars. For once, she wasn't interrupting or offering mechanical advice. She was just present, listening like what I was saying mattered. He had it all planned out. I continued. Display rooms with the stories behind each car, how they challenged the status quo, how they pushed boundaries. Not just Tuckers, but Studebakers, Hudsons, Nashes, all the companies that dared to be different and got crushed for it. Your grandfather was a revolutionary disguised as a mechanic, Sophie said finally. I laughed. He'd have loved that description. What started as a restoration project had somehow morphed into something bigger, a mission, a statement, a reclaiming of not just my grandfather's dream, but something within myself I hadn't realized was lost. My TikTok videos continued, documenting every step of the restoration. What began as a personal journal became something of a phenomenon. The first video to hit 1 million views showed Sophie and me carefully removing the Tucker's unique Cyclops center headlight, the third eye that turned with the steering wheel, illuminating corners before the car reached them. The comments section exploded. This isn't just a car restoration. It's literally watching American history come back to life. My grandfather told me about these cars. Never thought I'd see one being restored. Can't believe Detroit killed this company. Look at those innovations. I became known as the Tucker guy. Random people in town would stop me at the gas station or grocery store. Hey, you're the guy fixing up that weird old car, right? The three-eyed one? Man, I've been following your videos. That thing is incredible. My small corner of rural America became an unexpected pilgrimage site for classic car enthusiasts. They'd show up at the farm unannounced, hoping for a glimpse of the Tucker. Most were respectful, genuinely interested in the history and the restoration process. A few were annoying, the type who wanted to touch everything and offered unsolicited advice based on something their uncle's brother's friend once said about carburetors. Sophie became my gatekeeper, filtering visitors with a no-nonsense attitude that somehow never came across as rude. She had an uncanny ability to identify the real enthusiasts from the looky-loose. The genuine ones got tours, the others got polite but firm suggestions about calling ahead next time. Some nights, when the work became too frustrating or we hit a wall with a particularly stubborn mechanical problem, we'd take breaks on the farmhouse porch. Just sit there with beers in hand, looking up at stars that seemed impossibly bright compared to Pittsburgh's light-polluted skies. Those were the moments when the pressure faded, when the Tucker and its demands receded, and it was just us, the night, and possibilities. During one of those porch nights, with crickets providing the soundtrack and the Milky Way sprawled overhead like spilled diamonds, Sophie said something that shifted everything. "You know, you're not just fixing that car," she said, her voice soft but clear in the darkness. "You're fixing yourself." The words hung in the air between us, simple but profound. I turned to look at her profile, in the dim light from the kitchen window, behind us. She wasn't looking at me, just gazing up at the stars, a half-smile playing on her lips. I leaned over and kissed her. Not planned, not calculated, just the most natural action in the world at that moment. Her lips tasted like the cheap beer we'd been drinking, and something else. Something like possibility, like future, like home. When we pulled apart, she was smiling. "Took you long enough, city boy." That kiss changed things, but not in the way you might expect. There was no awkward morning after, no redefined relationship status, no big conversation about what we were now. We just flowed into something deeper. Her hand would find mine as we worked. I'd catch her watching me with a look that made my chest tight. We'd end work days with kisses that tasted like metal and motor oil, and somehow that was perfect. The Tucker restoration continued with renewed energy. Every setback became a challenge to overcome together rather than a reason to give up. Every small victory was sweeter because she was there to celebrate it. And then, out of nowhere, the past came knocking. I was uploading a new restoration video one night when the notification popped up on my phone. A direct message on Instagram from Heather. "Saw your videos. You've changed." Just 5 words. But they landed like a punch to the gut. Not because I missed her or wanted her back, but because of the audacity. Months of silence after she'd thrown her engagement ring at me. And now this, a vague statement that could be interpreted a dozen different ways. Sophie found me staring at my phone, my expression probably giving everything away. "X?" she asked, understanding immediately. I nodded, showing her the message. Sophie read it, then snorted. "Change? Yeah, you have. You're not trying to be something you're not anymore." She was right. I hadn't changed. I'd remembered who I was. There's a difference. I never replied to Heather's message. She hadn't betrayed me personally. She betrayed the values I held dear, the things that made me who I am. And you don't owe explanations to people who couldn't see your worth when you were standing right in front of them. Life has a rhythm sometimes, where everything suddenly clicks into place. After months of struggle and setback, the Tucker project hit that rhythm. Parts that had been on back order for weeks finally arrived. A collector in Texas sent us an original Tucker service manual he'd found in an estate sale, absolutely free, because he wanted to be part of the story. And then came the moment we'd been working toward. A cool September morning, dew still clinging to the grass, fog hanging low over the fields. The barn doors were wide open to the sunrise. Sophie and I had spent the entire night reassembling the engine after replacing a cracked cylinder head. "Ready?" she asked, standing by the driver's side door. I nodded, too nervous to speak. We'd been here before, moments of hope followed by crushing disappointment. There was no reason to think this time would be different. Sophie slid into the driver's seat. I connected the last battery cable and stepped back, heart pounding in my chest like it was trying to escape. The starter motor whined, a high-pitched mechanical scream that seemed to go on forever. Then a cough, a sputter, a moment of hesitation, that felt like standing on the edge of a cliff. And then the roar. The Tucker's engine caught, rumbled, and settled into a rhythmic growl that echoed off the barn walls like a primordial beast awakening from hibernation. It wasn't smooth. It rattled and shook, running rich and angry, but it was alive. Truly alive, not just a momentary sputter we'd achieved before. I stood there speechless as Sophie revved the engine gently. Her face split by a grin so wide it must have hurt. I grabbed my phone with shaking hands and hit record. "Grandpa," I said to the camera, my voice cracking with emotion. "He's breathing. The Tucker is alive." I panned around to capture the moment. The engine running. Sophie giving a thumbs up from the driver's seat, the morning sunlight streaming through the barn doors and illuminating the scene like something from a movie. I wasn't crying. Not exactly. But my vision was definitely blurry as I watched my grandfather's dream, this piece of American automotive history, this symbol of innovation and defiance, rumble back to life after half a century of silence. I knew, in that moment, that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, doing exactly what I was meant to do. The road to get here had been long and full of detours, but standing in that barn, listening to the Tucker's engine, holding Sophie's gaze across the hood, it all made sense. The video of the Tucker's rebirth went viral in a way none of my previous posts had. 5 million views in 2 days. Car magazines wanted interviews. Local news stations called. Even a few national outlets picked up the story. Amateur mechanic resurrects ultra-rare Tucker 48. The publicity was overwhelming and unexpected. My phone rang constantly. The farm's driveway filled with cars as people drove from hours away just to see the Tucker in person. Sophie and I started setting specific visiting hours just to maintain some semblance of privacy and work time. "You've created a monster," Sophie joked as we watched another carload of enthusiasts pull up the driveway. A very popular monster with 3 eyes. The attention brought something I hadn't anticipated. Opportunities. Parts suppliers offer components at cost. A custom upholstery shop volunteered to recreate the Tucker's unique interior for a fraction of the usual price, wanting only to be associated with the project. A local body shop offered their services for the final paint job, saying it would be an honor to help complete the restoration. The Tucker community, small but passionate, rallied around us. Old-timers who remembered seeing the cars when they were new shared stories. Collectors offered advice and encouragement. It was like being adopted into a family I never knew existed. The most surprising call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was underneath the Tucker, adjusting the rear suspension, when Sophie kicked my foot. "Phone," she said, handing me my ringing cell. Some guy from Barrett Jackson. Barrett Jackson. Even I knew that name. The premier collector car auction company in America, known for record-breaking sales, and their televised events in Scottsdale, Arizona. The man on the phone introduced himself as a senior acquisition specialist. He'd seen my videos, followed the restoration, and wanted to know if I consider bringing the Tucker to their January auction in Scottsdale. "We believe your Tucker 48 would be a significant draw," he explained in a polished voice that sounded like money. "Given its documented history and the public interest in your restoration, we anticipate substantial bidder interest." I listened, stunned, as he outlined what they could offer. Featured placement in the auction, promotion across their platforms, transportation assistance. "I'm not selling it," I said automatically, cutting him off mid-sentence. There was a pause on the line. "Mr. Wallace, I understand your attachment to the vehicle. However, Tucker 48s have recently commanded prices in excess of $3 million. Given your investment in the restoration..." "It's not about the money," I interrupted again. This was my grandfather's car, his dream. I restored it to preserve that, not to sell it. Another pause, longer this time. Then, surprisingly, a chuckle. "Your grandfather raised you right," he said, his tone warmer now. "But I'm not asking you to sell it. I'm inviting you to showcase it. We have a museum display section where significant vehicles can be exhibited without being auctioned. It would be an opportunity to share your grandfather's dream with thousands of enthusiasts." Now it was my turn to pause. I looked at Sophie, who was pretending not to eavesdrop while reorganizing tools that didn't need reorganizing. Can I think about it? I asked finally. Of course. The offer stands. We'd be honored to have your Tucker as part of the event, whether for sale or display. After hanging up, I relayed the conversation to Sophie. Her eyes widened at the mention of Barrett Jackson. That's the big leagues, Ethan. Like the Super Bowl car shows. I nodded, still processing. But is it what Grandpa would have wanted? To haul the Tucker across the country just to show it off. Sophie considered this, then smiled. Didn't you tell me you wanted to create a museum so people could see these cars? Learn their stories? Isn't this exactly that, on the biggest stage possible? She was right. As usual, this wasn't about ego or showing off. This was about sharing a piece of automotive history, about telling Preston Tucker's story and my grandfather's story to people who would appreciate it. I called Barrett Jackson back the next day and accepted their invitation. The Tucker will be displayed, not sold, at the January auction event. That week, as we continue working on the final details of the restoration, the upholstery, the paint, the chrome work, I felt a shift in the project's energy. We weren't just restoring a car for ourselves anymore. We were preparing to show the world that my grandfather had been right all along, that some dreams are worth holding on to, even when everyone tells you to let them go. I stood in the barn late one night, after Sophie had gone home, looking at the Tucker. It was nearly complete now, the torpedo-shaped body gleaming under the work lights, the unique three-eyed front end staring back at me like a mechanical cyclops. We did it, Grandpa, I said softly to the empty barn. We're taking your Tucker to Arizona. I knew then that this journey was about to enter a new phase. The restoration was nearly complete, but the story was just beginning. The road ahead would lead to Scottsdale, to bright lights and crowds, to a stage where the Tucker could finally be appreciated for what it was, a symbol of American innovation that refused to die. As I locked up the barn that night, I imagined my grandfather and Preston Tucker somewhere, sharing a whiskey and a laugh, watching as their shared dream roared back to life against all odds. The next morning, Sophie and I sat at my kitchen table, planning our trip to Arizona. Maps spread out, coffee cups between us. The January date circled in red on my calendar. Her knee touched mine under the table, a casual intimacy that still gave me butterflies. It's a 2,000-mile drive, she said, tracing the route with her finger. We could haul the Tucker in an enclosed trailer, take turns driving. I nodded, already imagining the journey. The two of us crossing the country with a piece of automotive history in tow. The vastness of the American landscape rolling past our windows. The anticipation building with each mile marker. I gripped my coffee mug tightly, suddenly aware that this moment, sitting in my grandfather's kitchen, planning this journey with Sophie, might be one of those perfect moments you only recognize in retrospect. The kind you look back on years later and think, that's when everything changed. What had started as a restoration had become a resurrection, not just of a car, but of a dream, a legacy, and somehow, along the way, myself. The journey to Arizona had been an adventure in itself. We'd rented a specialized enclosed trailer and driven cross-country in Sophie's dad's heavy-duty pickup. 3 days of highways, cheap motels, and diner food. 3 days of Sophie and me taking turns at the wheel, singing along to classic rock stations that faded in and out as we crossed state lines, talking about everything and nothing. 3 days of stopping at every rest area to check on the Tucker like nervous parents with a newborn. When we'd arrived in Scottsdale and unloaded the Tucker at the Barrett Jackson facility, a small crowd had already gathered. Word had spread. The TikTok guy with the Tucker 48 had arrived. Now, as the auction day arrived, the local auto museum's expert had examined the Tucker and confirmed what I'd known all along. This was one of the most authentic and well-documented restorations of the remaining 51 Tuckers ever built. The fact that it belonged to an original Tucker test driver, my grandfather, and had been lovingly restored by his grandson, made it not just a car, but a story. And Americans love a good story almost as much as they love a good comeback. The auction host, a silver-haired man in an immaculate suit whose voice could probably sell ice in Alaska, was introducing the Tucker to the packed room, and the cameras live streaming the event worldwide. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not just an automobile. he announced in that perfect announcer voice. This is American history on wheels. The Dream of Preston Tucker, preserved against all odds by Raymond Wallace and restored by his grandson, Ethan. Sophie nudged me. You're famous now, Tucker boy. I tried to smile, but my face felt frozen. This wasn't what I had planned. When we'd agreed to bring the Tucker to Barrett Jackson, it was supposed to be just for display. That had been the plan right up until our second night in Scottsdale, when Sophie and I had stayed up late in our hotel room, talking about the future. What happens after we take the Tucker home? She'd asked, lying beside me on the hotel bed, her head propped up on her elbow. I hadn't really thought that far ahead. The restoration had consumed my life for so long that completion seemed like a finish line, not the beginning of something new. I guess we just enjoy it? I'd offered weekly. Take it to car shows? Drive it on Sundays? Sophie had been quiet for a moment, then said something that changed everything. Your grandfather didn't save that Tucker just to have it sit in a barn for another 50 years. He wanted people to see it, to remember what it represented. We talked for hours that night about dreams and legacies and purposes, about my grandfather's vision for a museum of survivor cars, about how much money it would take to make that happen, about all the other forgotten classics out there, waiting for someone to save them. By sunrise, I'd made the hardest decision of my life. I would sell the Tucker. Not because I didn't love it, not because I'd given up on my grandfather's dream, but because I'd finally understood what that dream really was. It wasn't about owning a Tucker. It was about what the Tucker represented. Innovation, defiance, the refusal to let good ideas die. With the money from the sale, I could buy the land adjacent to farm. I could build that museum my grandfather had envisioned. I could rescue and restore dozens of other endangered classics that deserved a second chance. I could create something that would outlast me, just as the Tucker had outlasted my grandfather. Sophie had held me as I cried that night, finally letting go of the idea that keeping the Tucker was the only way to honor my grandfather's memory. Now, standing in that auction room, I felt a strange calm replace my earlier anxiety. This wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. The bidding started at $1 million and quickly escalated. $1.5 million. $2 million. $2.5 million. Each increment sending a ripple of excitement through the crowd. Sophie's grip on my hand tightened with each jump in price. At $3 million, the bidding slowed, narrowing to two determined buyers. A tech billionaire from Silicon Valley known for his car collection, and a silver-haired man in the front row who had the quiet confidence of old money. $3.2 million, announced the auctioneer. Do I hear 3.4? The tech billionaire nodded slightly. 3.4 million. The auctioneer called out. Do I hear 3.6? The silver-haired man raised his paddle. 3.6 million. The auctioneer's voice rose with excitement. Do I hear 3.8? Another nod from the tech billionaire. $3.8 million. Ladies and gentlemen, we are approaching $4 million for this extraordinary piece of American history. The silver-haired man hesitated, then raised his paddle one final time. $4 million, the auctioneer called out, his voice echoing through the hushed room. The tech billionaire shook his head slightly. He was out. $4 million going once, going twice. Sold for $4 million to Mr. Robert Carson of San Francisco, California. The room erupted in applause. $4 million. The price of a dream. Of my grandfather's legacy, of months of sweat, tears, and grease-stained hands. Sophie threw her arms around me, and I buried my face in her hair, overwhelmed by the moment. Through the blur of my vision, I could see the silver-haired man, Robert Carson, approaching the stage with a look of reverence as he gazed at the Tucker. Grandpa, I whispered, we did it. After the auction, Mr. Carson sought me out. He wasn't what I'd expected. Not an impersonal collector adding another trophy to his garage, but passionate enthusiast with genuine appreciation for the Tucker's significance. My father worked briefly at the Tucker plant before it closed, he explained, his eyes bright with emotion. He never stopped talking about how that car could have changed everything. I've been looking for one my whole life. He promised a Tucker would be displayed in his private museum, open to the public several days a month. He even invited Sophie and me to visit whenever we wanted, to check up on your baby, as he put it. As we watched the Tucker being carefully loaded for transport to its new California home, I felt something between sadness and profound satisfaction, like watching your child graduate and move away. Heartbreaking and exactly as it should be, all at once. The media attention was unexpected. CNN wanted an interview, so did several car magazines and classic auto shows. Overnight, I went from being the Tucker guy on TikTok to something of a minor celebrity in the automotive world. Standing awkwardly in front of cameras, I tried to convey what the project had really been about. I didn't do this for the money. I did it so my grandfather's voice could continue to be heard, so people would remember that innovation shouldn't be crushed by corporate interests, so a piece of American history wouldn't be forgotten. My social media following exploded. People who never care about classic cars were captivated by the story. Not just the Tucker, but of me choosing my grandfather's dream over conventional path, of finding purpose and preservation, of seeing value where others saw only rust. The attention brought something else I hadn't anticipated, ghosts from my past. Heather called 3 days after we returned from Scottsdale, then texted, then emailed. She wanted to meet, to talk, to reconnect now that I was, in her words, in a better place financially. I finally responded with a simple text. You chose an HGTV kitchen. I chose Seoul. We made our choices. My family came around too. Dad called, awkward and gruff but genuinely apologetic. Aunt Linda sent a card with a heartfelt note about how proud my grandfather would have been. They'd seen the auction on television, seen the interviews, finally understood what I'd been trying to explain all along. I forgave them. How could I not? But I also set boundaries. This is my life, not yours. I'll walk my own path. You know what's funnier than $4 million? I asked Sophie one evening as we sat on the farmhouse porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in impossible colors. What? She asked, leaning her head on my shoulder. When your ex thinks you'll come running back because she reconsidered now that you've got money, as if that changes anything about who she is, or who I am. Sophie laughed so hard she snorted beer through her nose, which only made us laugh harder. We ended up in tears, clutching our sides, the laughter cleansing and pure. We put the money to good use. After taxes and setting aside a nest egg, we had enough to make the dream real. We bought the adjacent 50 acres, giving us nearly 100 acres of prime countryside. We renovated the old barn into a world-class restoration shop. We built a purpose-designed museum building to showcase American automotive innovations that had been ahead of their time. 6 months after the auction, Second Chance Classics opened its doors. The sign above the entrance featured a silhouette of the Tucker 48 and the tagline, "Cars have souls. They deserve second chances." Sophie ran the mechanical side, while I handled the restoration projects and the growing YouTube channel that documented our work. People brought us their forgotten classics, Studebaker Avantis, Nash Metropolitans, Kaiser Darrens, Corvairs, Edsels, cars that represented the road less traveled in automotive history. Each restoration became a story we shared with our growing audience. Each car had its own personality, its own challenges, its own reason for existing. We weren't just fixing old cars. We were preserving chapters of American innovation, rebellion, and creativity. The business took off faster than we'd expected. Within a year, we had a waiting list of projects and had hired 4 full-time mechanics, all specially trained in classic restoration techniques. Sophie's dad closed his shop in town and joined us, bringing decades of experience and an encyclopedic knowledge of obscure part sources. The museum attracted visitors from across the country, car enthusiasts, history buffs, families looking for something different. The centerpiece was a full-scale replica of the Tucker 48 that we'd built using original plans and specifications. Not the same as having the real thing, but a powerful symbol nonetheless. The following spring, Sophie and I got married on the farm. No fancy venue, no elaborate decorations, just hay bales for seating, string lights and trees, beer kegs and galvanized tubs, and Motown music playing on a vintage record player that had belonged to my grandfather. Sophie wore jeans under a simple white dress, a wrench tucked into her pocket for luck. I wore my grandfather's restored leather jacket over a white shirt. Our vows included promises to never stop each other from chasing dreams, no matter how impractical they might seem. As we danced under the stars, surrounded by friends, family, yes, even my dad and Aunt Linda, and the various cars in different stages of restoration, I caught a glimpse of our newest project sitting in the open barn door. Another Tucker 48, this one in even worse shape than my grandfather's had been. But this one wasn't for selling. This one was for keeping, for driving, for loving. That's it right there, I whispered to Sophie. The American dream on wheels. Second Chance Classics continue to grow. Our YouTube channel hit 1 million subscribers. People sent us cars from all over the country. Sometimes just to be restored, sometimes to be featured in the museum. Each one came with a story. The Camaro that had been someone's high school pride and joy, now rescued from a divorce sale. The 57 Buick that had taken a family across the country 6 times. Even the occasional tractor, saved from the scrap heap because it had plowed the fields that fed generations. We expanded the farm buildings, restoring the old house to its former glory while maintaining its character. The museum grew to include an educational center where we taught restoration techniques to high school students and veterans looking for new skills. The sign at the entrance to the property read, "For those they called crazy." My grandfather would have loved that. Our YouTube channel became a place where I shared not just mechanical knowledge, but life philosophy. The parallels between restoring cars and restoring lives, between seeing potential in rusty metal and seeing it in ourselves. My final video about each project always included a dedication to the dreamers who created these machines, to the people who'd loved them, and to my grandfather who taught me that persistence means more than talent. One particularly popular video featured a 1953 Buick Skylark, a car almost as rare as a Tucker. At the end, I added a simple caption, "For my grandfather, and for all the dreamers who refused to give up." The comments section filled with people sharing stories of their own grandfathers, their own abandoned dreams they were thinking of revisiting, their own projects they'd set aside but were now inspired to complete. Almost 2 years after selling the Tucker, I was working on a particularly challenging Packard Caribbean when I found a small photograph that had slipped behind the glove compartment. It showed the car when it was new, with a happy family standing proudly beside it. A simple reminder that every car we restored wasn't just metal and chrome. It was memories, moments, lives lived. That night, I shared the find with Sophie as we sat on the porch. She smiled and rested her head on my shoulder, her hand instinctively moving to her growing belly. Life is like an old car, I've learned. Sometimes you have to break it down to the frame to find its soul. Sometimes the parts that seem most damaged are the ones that, once restored, shine the brightest. Sometimes the longest journeys start with an engine that refuses to turn over, with rust that seems too deep to overcome, with odds that any reasonable person would walk away from. 3 years after that fateful day when I'd chosen my grandfather's Tucker over my engagement to Heather, Sophie and I sat on the porch of the farmhouse on a perfect summer evening. Our first child was due in a month. In the yard sat a 1957 Pontiac Star Chief that had just arrived, waiting for its second chance at life. Inside the house, my grandfather's letters were framed on the wall of my office, alongside photos of the Tucker at various stages of its restoration. I sipped lemonade, no beer for Sophie these days, and watched the fireflies begin their evening dance over the fields. The distant sound of the restoration shop's radio drifted across the property. One of the mechanics was working late on a particularly challenging project. Sophie's hand found mine, her wedding ring clinking against my callous fingers. "Penny for your thoughts," she said. I smiled, looking out over the kingdom we'd built from rust and dreams and second chances. A place where history was preserved, where innovation was celebrated, where every dent and scratch told a story worth knowing. "Just thinking that I'm home, Grandpa," I said softly to the evening air. "I'm finally home.